today's episode of Virtual Sentiments, I talked to Dr. Eric Schliesser, professor of political science at University of Amsterdam. Our conversation is focused on Adam Smith, the 18th century political economist and philosopher that you see depicted in our logo. Much of our conversation is rooted in Eric's excellent book, Adam Smith, Systematic Philosopher and Public Thinker. Just like Smith, Eric is a public philosopher, and he blogs regularly at his Substack, Digressions Impressions. The first half of this episode focuses on some of the key features of Adam Smith's work, whereas the second half is dedicated to drawing on those insights while reflecting on liberalism and democratic politics today. While Smith is often seen primarily as a kind of forefather to capitalism, what I think is really at the heart of his work is an astute and often moving account of human sociability and the myriad ways in which we are reliant on each other in moving through and understanding our world. I hope you'll feel that sensibility come through in both the content and form of our conversation. Thank you so much for talking with us today, Eric.
Thank you for having me, Kristen. I look forward to
it. Great, me too. So as you know, one of the reasons why I was particularly excited to have you on the podcast is because we at Mercatus and various among a lot of our programs, but also this podcast in particular, we make a lot of references to Adam Smith, the political economist and moral philosopher. And this podcast gets its name from Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I thought it would be really great to have a conversation with such an esteemed Smith scholar such as yourself. And not only that you work on Smith, but your book really foregrounds Smith as your title says, as a public thinker, as a public philosopher, which is also what we're trying to do with this podcast too. So I'm hoping that we could start off a little bit with kind of what does it mean to think of Adam Smith as a public thinker?
You would think I could rattle off a question and answer immediately, having written a 300-page book on it. But it took me actually a while to figure out what it is I wanted to say in the book. And now that I'm reloading my memory devices, I think as I was writing the book, I came to see that he could be exemplary in a way for how to think about the relationship between incredibly abstract and theoretical ideas and shaping public opinion and maybe moving into policy. And actually, as I was writing the book, I had the feeling that liberalism today had kind of forgotten how to do that. So I kind of secretly thought, oh, this book will be like the first of a trilogy of books where he'll be like an historical exemplar, and then I'll move into public policy, and 2 or 3 other books will follow naturally. So now to answer your question, David Hume, his friend, starts the Treatise of a Human Nature with a kind of weird preface where he says something like, this book is meant for a public, and its reaction will test the validity of the ideas. That's a very loose paraphrase. And I was very struck by that because I'd been reading social history at the time that the idea of public opinion itself was only being developed as something significant by people like Hume later in his career. And so I had this thought that Hume was kind of pretending or writing as if the material that he was writing was simultaneously being tested by an audience, and that their uptake would be in a way a validation of the ideas that he was presenting. And then, of course, somewhat famously, his book, at least he likes to pretend this later in his career, was kind of a colossal failure. People really more or less ignored it. It didn't set up debate. And it also ruined Hume's chances to get a job. So I thought, okay, if I look at Smith, did he learn something from Hume's self-presentation and also from his self-understanding. And the more I thought about it, I think the answer was yes. So I think Smith tried to write in such a way such that both professional thinkers, serious academics, university professors, theologians, judges, that they would get what he was up to, but that a wider, more educated audience would also get what he was up to. So the first part of this public facing element is really about style. Can you write to multiple audiences at the same time? Can you hold people's attention while speaking at different levels at once? I actually think that most of us who are university professors actually learn to do that over time. So I teach a lecture course in actually, and Smith used to teach lecture courses, 5 times a week, several times a day. And you just know there are bright kids and there are slower kids in the classroom, and you have to keep them on board at the same time. So I actually think Smith was very experienced in doing what I said he was doing. And he found a way, I think, in his writing to do that. But the second and perhaps more important element of this is while you're communicating with an audience, and Smith was a professor of rhetoric himself. In fact, in many ways, he was the first English lit professor ever. But in addition to rhetoric and communication and shaping your audience, I also think that he thought that what one aims to do has to be informed by a sense of responsibility and a sense of serving the public good. And I think his understanding of what philosophy, at least the public facing part, had to be was informed by this kind of moral vision of how to get a collective or the community do the right kind of thing. And I actually think that's also what his philosophy or public policy is about, namely getting collectives to do the right thing, to be committed to the good society or open society, or the shared good. So I actually think he enacts that in his work and he defends it as well. So that's my answer to your question.
No, it's excellent, and that is exactly what I thought would be great to frame this conversation about because, especially when we read some of these texts today, we, for our own language, our own conventions, and what we're used to, they can seem even more abstract than they probably were at the time. Because I really do think like once you get used to kind of the texts of political theory and reading these, when you read someone like Smith and especially the theory of moral sentiments, he's using all these examples from theater. He's using a lot of illustrative examples in general, and he's trying to help the reader along, and he's criticizing other books on sort of social norms or moral norms and or morality, moral judgments as being very dry and disagreeable and not literally the words that he uses and not inspiring the kind of feelings and motivations that need to be inspired in readers to be concerned with the issues at hand. So I think it's really good to keep in mind, everything you've explained about sort of the nascent understanding of public opinion as a kind of social force and the way that Smith would be approaching his writing, also informed by his experiences lecturing students. I think that's great. And I thought another thing that we want to get on the table right away is that some people, if they're listening to this, are very, very familiar with Smith's work, but there'll be, and I hope, a lot of people who aren't as familiar. And so a lot of people who aren't as familiar with Smith kind of see him as this paragon of greed and self-interest. And in fact, there is also, a debate in the literature that speaks to, I think, this understanding or this image of Smith in what's called the Das Adam Smith problem, which suggests, and it's from a German historical school understanding of Smith, and the idea that his book on political economy, The Wealth of Nations, and the theory of moral sentiments are actually inconsistent with each other, that he offers two very different images of human nature and of society. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, both how it's shaped your work, but also just what that entails. Why is it that there was this understanding? Why do people think of Smith as very, very concerned with self-interest, and a sort of, Mandevillian private vices lead to public virtue understanding of society?
Yeah, so when I was a PhD student, so this is now almost 25 to 30 years ago, this Adam Smith problem, and when you say it in German, it sounds immediately more serious, of course, really was taken to be a weighty interpretive problem. And I was lucky that when I was a grad student, there were four or five other very good scholars, Ryan Hanley, Vanna Foreman, who were direct colleagues and who with me would attend seminars by Sam Fleischacker, who was writing his books on Adam Smith at the time. So we would be debating this Adam Smith problem almost weekly in cafes and discussing it after Sam's lectures. And I felt that Sam, but also people like Griswold and later my friend Leon Montes, that they had kind of dissolved the Adam Smith problem successfully. So I really, from as I entered the job market, I decided it wasn't going to be my problem, right? So I just felt like they'd solved it. Now, later, when I wrote my book, I realized that I was actually addressing this Adam Smith problem without intending it to, and that I actually had my own solution to it, and that is rather than seeing a problem, let's imagine that he's consistent, right, and systematic, and see how far that takes us. And I remember just being overjoyed when this other Chilean scholar, Maria Carrasco, in her review of my book says, yeah, until now, we all thought there was an this Adam Smith problem, and Eric has shown actually the opposite. We should take him as coherent. And I was like, yeah, by not addressing the problem, things get much easier. And that's, good scholarly advice, but doesn't answer your question. So I have also in preparing this conversation, I have thought quite a bit about it. And I actually think that this Adam Smith problem is actually a consequence of the division of labor in the academy. So once there was a specialized discipline, call it political economy or call it economics, in which Adam Smith either figured as a hero or as a father of the discipline or as the villain, as he was for the German historical school, I think The Wealth of Nations got interpreted as a really one sided book. And as a book about self interest, and perhaps even as a book about selfishness and greed being good. And then, as a side effect, when people also discovered and realized he was a moral philosopher, which, particularly if in a German and post Kantian inflection, really is about doing good at the expense of oneself, right? That one's self interest cannot really enter into a good making feature. That's very Kantian, but also very Christian. Then you have this kind of problem how to reconcile these two books. But one thing that I always recognized about The Wealth of Nations, and I think Emma Rothschild, in her wonderful book, which has sentiments in the title, I'm spacing on it.
Economic sentiments, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. Really makes clear is that The Wealth of Nations is a deeply political book. That in fact, understanding it as a book on economics, while that's not misleading, also misses out all the politics and political economy, but with the emphasis on politics and political economy that book actually contains. And I think my own interpretation of The Wealth of Nations, even when I was thinking of myself as a pure philosopher and not as a political theorist, always was very politics oriented. And just recently, a few weeks ago, Don Klein from George Mason, actually from Marquesas, I think, he and I saw each other, and we don't agree on very much about Adam Smith, but he reminded me of a letter that William Robertson, historian, sent to Adam Smith just after the book was published. And in that book, Robertson, the great historian, says, "Hey, Smith, you've done this amazing job in politics because you showed that Locke and the whole Whig revolution and all the mercantilists, they're a bunch of, paraphrasing, they're a bunch of dangerous villains." And this is Robertson's first real letter to Smith after the publication of the book. And he immediately sees this is a major political book. As Don and I both also recognize, it's also emphasizes the word liberal in a distinctly modern way. So that's where he and I agree about this. But I loved just seeing that passage again, because in a weird way, I think this Adam Smith problem is itself a consequence of an intellectual division of labor and an understanding of what economics is that's in many ways depoliticized. Once you drop those assumptions, I don't think there is a genuine Adam Smith problem, because The Wealth of Nations is a very different book than people take it to be. Now, my friend George Maria Paganelli, many years ago, she already made this point in a lovely article that says if you really take the text of both books seriously, then The Wealth of Nations is a much more public spirited book than The Theory of Moral Sentiments. I don't know how serious she was about that paper. I read it as a fantastic joke, but maybe Maria Pia actually believes this. But I think it gets something really importantly right about Smith, that The Wealth of Nations cannot exist in an Adam Smith problem because it presupposes public spirit and basically tells the reader how to get there.
Yeah, no, that is a very compelling approach and way of putting it. Yeah, I will admit, cards on the table. I've always been a little bit. I don't know how to put it, but I think I've really relayed to the story you told about kind of seeing the Das Adam Smith problem as settled, that there was no contradiction, and so that wasn't going to be the focus of your work. But then your work ending up, in a way, responding to it in a very clear and powerful way too. Yeah. So I love that, and I'm thankful for that. And it's also partly because of that I've also similarly been like, well, we have already settled that. That's not a particularly interesting debate anymore.
I remember years ago, Jim Ottison's book addressed the Adam Smith problem. His first one, 2002, and he did get comments from other scholars. Why are you addressing a problem that has already been settled? Right, even rather critical problems, and we shouldn't be talking about it. And I did feel at the time that is an unfair response, because I think we always have a duty and obligation to reopen issues if we think something has gone wrong in previous attempts. But yeah, like you, I think there's so many other interesting issues in Smith. I do hope we don't have to talk a lot about it in the future.
Yeah, I know. That's a really good way to put it. And I definitely do think it's actually interesting, kind of the way that intellectual dialogue happens, where sometimes, at one moment it feels like something's settled, but then some debate rages on as though it hadn't been settled. So then kind of always returning and addressing these questions is kind of eternal, I think, in some way.
Yeah, me too. I also think that there's a mismatch, and this you asked me already about in this, but I didn't address yet. There's also a mismatch between how the scholars, scholars who are working on a figure or topic, how their conversation evolves, and then a wider set of scholars, say who write for the New York Review of Books or the London Review of Books or who do podcasts, right? How they think about an issue, and then a kind of informed public who's actually trying to keep track, but certainly not going to read journal articles. And those three levels, they interact in complex ways. And so it's good to have like these reality checks about, okay, where do we stand around on a problem like this? Because you also kind of know and expect that even if you and I become the most powerful Adam Smith scholars in the universe, that even if we were to agree the Adam Smith problem should be buried 6 feet under, it will show up in all kinds of places anyway, because this image of economics as being about greed and Smith being the father of economics, these things are not going to go away just because we want that to. So I think that's unavoidable, and I think in a way that's also Smith's own understanding of public life. Is yes, you can aim at enlightenment, but you shouldn't expect enlightenment to happen instantaneously. That's not how these things work.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to put it. And so just to kind of bring this fully around, because we talked a little bit about Wealth of Nations, which we'll talk more about, but theory of moral sentiments is, I think, is the sort of disjuncture is partly what's going on. And you mentioned that the German historical school, from that post-Kantian perspective, was, it was then difficult to kind of grasp what Smith's doing in theory of moral sentiments and how it could be consistent with a theory of the economy that does allow for there to be commerce based in self-interested motives, exchange that is allowing collaboration, but in pursuing self-interest. So I was wondering if you could just kind of walk us through a little bit some of the kind of basic principles of the theory of moral sentiments. So, like, for example, something that you talk about in the book, and we don't have to talk about this as much, but something I think it would be important for people to understand is that we think of, if we hear the phrase moral sentiments, where we might immediately think like, okay, feelings that lead to moral judgments of some kind. But actually, what is the understanding of moral in that time period is to be describing social causes, social factors like institutions and social practices and social norms, rather than, and as distinct from a philosophy that studies natural causes. So distinct from arguments that have to do with geography, let's say, various physical resources. So yeah, so that's just one kind of thing. But then I think what's also great about your work, your book, is clarifies that even while we want to clarify, oh, theory of moral sentiments is really something more about social, maybe social psychology even, and sociology in some respects. He's still making normative arguments about morality and about moral judgments. So, kind of for somebody who maybe hasn't read the book, some basic things to kind of understand, particularly that could be helpful if they do decide to pick it up after listening to our conversation.
Yeah. So first of all, I think you did a marvelous job explaining the issue. So if it were up to me, I'd just stay quiet. You keep talking here. But so the theory of moral sentiments, was a heavily rewritten book, and so it evolves over time. And I actually think, and I've read it every few years, and I find new things in it. So what I'm going to say is today's provisional answer. I liked how you emphasize what the word moral sentiments means and what I think it means too. One other thing that I came to realize, particularly when I was writing my book, and I kind of decided that I should give an account of Smith's theory of human nature and how the passions work. And I got really interested in the kind of mechanics of the passions and sentiments, because these are kind of more or less synonymous, not exactly synonymous words. And I thought, okay, if I explain what a sentiment is, I can really explain what the theory of moral sentiments is about. And then I realized that, in fact, Smith himself is responding to a couple of 100-year taxonomy of the sentiments, and Descartes and Spinoza and Malebranche and Hume. And he's himself giving his own interpretation of that. And I use some of his late work or posthumously published work to do that in the history of astronomy and the essays on philosophical subjects. And one thing I realized is, once I start to decompose what Smith means by passion, and by sentiment, he actually thinks that other people, our expectations about how others will respond, are actually built into our own feelings. So in the book, I use highfalutin philosophic language. I say, look, he actually thinks that our feelings are normative in a certain way. But in a more matter of fact way of speaking, he just thinks that how we respond to the world, how we sense the world, and how we feel when we experience the world, we actually incorporate expectations of others into our feelings. That's part of our education, that's part of our cultivation, that's part of our growing up. We start doing that automatically. And when I noticed that that's how he's thinking about feelings, I thought that's striking, because that's kind of also what makes the theory of moral sentiments famous, namely this theory of the impartial spectator, which is all about having the view of some idealized version of ourselves, or an objective partisan who is looking on to us, or a spectator, to internalize the feelings of that kind of hypothetical person. And so I realized suddenly that his real moral theory, namely built around the impartial spectator, and his theory of human nature, that those are really the same side of the coin, or two sides of a lock. And so that also helps explain this puzzle that I think this real puzzle that you articulated, although didn't emphasize. Namely, how can a book that on the one hand looks like it's about empirical social science and, and social psychology be at the same time about moral judgment? The way you and I are educated professionally, we're often told those two things are different. They belong in different disciplines, they're different kind of entities, and they shouldn't be part of the same, they shouldn't be the same thing. And I think Smith's book shows, and he's not alone, this is, I think, more common in the 18th century, that if on a certain understanding of how the world is, a certain kind of judgment comes out more or less automatically. And from one perspective, that violates an is-ought barrier, and violates, it looks like an elementary blunder that, let's be unfair for a moment, empirical psychologists or empirical economists make, or neuroscientists make, or quantum physicists make when they try to philosophize. And at the other hand, it's also a way of doing philosophy that's completely consistent and coherent and plausible as well. And so I think once you have a certain picture of how human psychology is works and is supposed to work, then moral judgment comes out more or less for free. And I think that's also helps explain in part that Smith could be both doing kind of armchair descriptive psychology, and at the same time moral phenomenology, and at the same time normative ethics. And although this surprised me when I wrote my own book, but somebody like Near Ben Moshe shown that he's also doing meta ethics, and that these things all can be part of the same project. So I hope I've answered your question and not confused things more, but I think I got there.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree. I think the impartial spectator is one of the most important aspects of Smith's work, and I think you did a great job also explaining that. In addition to situating us a little bit in terms of exactly the idea that right now our academic studies, our sciences are extremely specialized and separate, whereas when you're encountering works like this, other earlier works, they're going to be transcending a lot of those divisions that we're used to, which then also makes it kind of challenging too to interpret because, like you said, it might seem almost methodologically suspect in some way that he's not doing this sort of separation of describing the world from evaluating how it should be, or whether it's good that it's one way, or kind of how we should orient ourselves to it. And I think so another thing though that I think is good to mention is that one of the trickiest parts of Smith's work, but is also really important, is why there's this sometimes thinking that Wealth of Nations is separate or contradictory to the theory of moral sentiments, is that Wealth of Nations starts out with a lot of comments about kind of our propensities, quote unquote. And one of them is a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, relating to kind of commercial interdependency, the way that the division of labor helps us specialize, and then we can kind of trade what we've made with others to get what we want, or using money to facilitate that process as well. And as a part of those arguments, he talks about how it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, brewer, baker. I'm probably getting the order wrong, but that we get our dinner, but from their self-interest and appeal to self-interest, which is again just referring to when we trade our goods or pay for goods, we're doing it out of interest, not out of charity. But then that gets contrasted to the very beginning, honestly, of Theory of Moral Sentiments' opening line that howsoever selfish man be supposed there are evidently, some principles in our nature that make us interested in the good fortune of others or interested in the fortune of others for no other reason, like for no utility, for no purpose other than the fact that we derive pleasure in seeing the good fortune of people. So that seems to be automatically at odds. And what he's building through theory of moral sentiments is this notion of sympathy. And sympathy helps us, which is also, I don't know, maybe better in our language, the way that he uses the term sympathy, we might be better at using the term empathy, which is just that we can kind of feel and relate to someone else's feelings, kind of regardless of whatever those feelings are, whether they're joy, grief, sorrow, regret, anger, things like that. And so that sympathy is the way that that process works that you were describing, this sort of intersubjective process where the expectations of other people can shape our feelings. And then also vice versa, our feelings kind of inform what we develop as appropriate in society, and also what an impartial spectator would judge, which is actually, I think, distinct from necessarily what the typical member of the public might judge in any given situation. That's like the real challenge. And so the thing about sympathy that I wanted to kind of get to here, well, one, I think that sympathy can be consistent with the opening remarks of Wealth of Nations, and that it's only through sympathy that we can kind of evaluate the actions of other people and know, okay, well, I'm getting this thing from this person because I'm giving them something in return, not because they're just giving it to me as like a charitable effort in a way. It's sort of the way that we can start to try to understand what's going on in other people's minds and their actions. But then again, there is this sort of question is there a stronger kind of other oriented component of Smith's work and their moral sentiments of how far does our sympathy carry us in terms of feeling compassionate for others and wanting to help others? And this is sort of me trying to transition us into another topic I was hoping we would discuss, which is that, something that Smith has been understood as for a long time, which I think is also a bit of a misperception, is the idea that Smith is a Stoic. Or a neo-Stoic. And so I wondered if you could walk us a little bit through what that argument is and sort of the challenges, why people, challenge that view. Because I also think that's important for bringing us into like a discussion of contemporary liberalism and potentially Smith's relevance to contemporary debates.
Yes, so you've raised multiple levels here, questions and levels at once. And so if I lose track of my own thread, but also of the actual question you're asking, feel free to steer us back gently. So let me start at the end. I have quite a bit to say, and I've been recently been thinking about the start of the Wealth of Nations again. So I actually have a lot of fresh ideas there. But let's start with the Smith as Stoic view. Now, I think when I became a PhD student, there were these wonderful Glasgow edition, Liberty Fund sponsored editions of the Wealth of Nations, and they came with fantastic footnotes and really very learned introductions. And that editorial group, they really collectively understood Smith and his place in 18th century moral philosophy as a kind of updating of Stoicism. And that makes a lot of sense because basically from 1600 onward, if you are an intelligent Christian, but you had your doubts about a lot of the fine grained theological metaphysics of Christianity, Stoicism was a perfectly respectable second best way of being virtuous, Christian sounding, and public spirited. And so there are, in fact, a lot of Christian Stoics and a lot of people who are maybe not so Christian, but more deist who embrace various forms of Stoicism in this period. And especially if you also think that Smith has a kind of providential belief in progress. We haven't mentioned the invisible hand yet, but if you think the invisible hand is really a metaphor for this providential progress, and you also believe, as in fact was quite common in the 20th century, but not before. This is some new work I've done. That Smith himself believes in a harmony of interest and a natural harmony of interest, then it's quite natural that if you're reading Smith with those frames in mind, that he sounds like a Stoic. Also, because, and you've done work on this yourself, he quotes the Stoics left and right in all kinds of clever ways, sometimes directly, sometimes if you go to the original source, you see it. So it makes total sense to think of Smith as a Stoic. However, what I noticed when I read the theory of moral sentiments is that he actually, in his own voice, he can be quite critical of Stoicism. Not as an aside, but when he actually deals with the Stoics, it's a surprisingly critical treatment. So I didn't thought, one of those summers, I'm just going to go through the theory of moral sentiments and look both every time that the editors say he's a Stoic and also look at what he says about Stoicism and just sort of add them up. And I came away thinking he's not a Stoic. He thinks that the Stoic life is unachievable, really, for ordinary people. He thinks it has a way too demanding moral ideal. I also think he thinks it has a view of human nature that's not realistic. And he has, lots of more local and specific criticisms. And I actually think that part of the theory of moral sentiments is taking aim not just at ancient Stoics, but also at this fusion of Christianity and Stoicism that was very popular in the 18th century. Now, I put my views on that together in a very polemical book review of Didi Raphael 14, 15 years ago. And then I kind of felt like I was done with this material. Then much later, I got interested in Seneca for completely independent reasons. And there I saw that Seneca, who's often classified as a late Stoic, himself kind of anticipates most of Smith's criticisms of the Stoics. So now that I'm older and less polemical, I'm willing to say that if you think of Smith as a Seneca style Stoic, then yeah, sure, there's overlap, but even so, there's genuine disagreements as well. Now, I've already hinted at one, I think, really important element here, and that is this harmony of interest doctrine. And this also gets back to this Adam Smith problem of yours. A lot of people read the Wealth of Nations as kind of defending a harmony of interest doctrine. And I just don't think that's a good reading of the Wealth of Nations.
I agree.
I actually think Smith himself was very clear that he thought that, to put it in pure basic economics, that wage earners and what we would now call capitalists, that they had diametrically opposed interest. Profit and wages are zero sum. Now, in a growing economy, both sides, can be bought off in a way such that this isn't doesn't have to be class warfare leading to revolution, right? But he definitely also thought that a lot of what we would now call rent seeking and that he associated with mercantilism came at the expense of other people, right? So the idea that he's this theorist of frictionless peace and harmony, we all get along, it makes no sense of the book itself and what he says in a lot of places. Now, this does get to your point. It's having on the one level described genuine substantive conflicts of interest. He does think that we can both get what we want under certain conditions. If there's a good rule of law, if our expectations are properly stabilized, if we don't feel vulnerable, we learn to, and this gets back to this rhetorical issue as well, we learn to communicate with each other by seeing each other's perspective and by persuading each other, for instance, that if we trade, we can both get what we want. And that and also have a pie that grows rather than shrinks. So I do think that this mechanism that you've emphasized, namely sympathy, that putting ourselves in the shoes of others, that in a well-functioning economy, this is something that both can be cultivated and can become something that's a source of mutual gain. But at the same time, Smith is under no illusion that often we try to rig the game in our own benefit. So that we still use the sympathetic mechanism, but then rather than to deal with each other, from mutual respect and compassionately, we try to figure out how we can get one better on each other, right? So we're being capable of empathy and compassion also means that we're capable of being strategic actors. And I think Smith himself puts that insight into a much broader, both institutional and psychological framework, both in the Wealth of Nations and in the theory of moral sentiments. So that's also my way of thinking of how the two interact. Now, I want to make two much more fine grained points. That very passage about the baker, the brewer, and how we interact with the beggar makes really two further points that I don't think get emphasized enough. On the one hand, Smith actually does say that we sometimes give to the beggar from pure benevolence. He doesn't say we always expect the beggar to trade with us. We are compassionate. And the other thing he says, and this was something that I think Sam Fleischacker first pointed out and I ran with, is in that very same sentence, he treats the beggar as a fellow citizen. And that to me was mind blowing because, on the one hand, beggars really didn't have the vote in 18th and 19th century Scotland, right? It wasn't a democracy. So to think of a beggar who really was potentially a drain on the community in the first instance, also as a fellow citizen, really told me that the book A is political, right? Citizenship is right there. Trading with others is in part trading with others, rights holders or people who have moral status. But it also got me thinking, okay, well, what is in fact the political significance of this? And here again, I think your emphasis on sympathy matters because I think what Smith really was trying to get his readers to see is that in trading life, but also when we give compassionately to each other, we can deal with each other both in terms of subservience and servility, in terms of status hierarchy, and we can choose to deal with each other in terms of a fundamental equality. Now, 18th century Scotland was still a society of orders and ranks and feudal lords. And so servility was in many ways the natural fallback, even though the Scots and the British thought of themselves, at least some of the days of the week, as Christian, right? And I really think that part of Smith's enterprise is to say, okay, how can we move all the ways of interacting that entrench servility into something that makes us fundamentally see each other as equals? And I think as sympathy as a mechanism, your colleague David Levy first taught me this. It really presupposes fundamental equality. It's something that works best with a background level of equality. And I got very interested in the history of the metaphysics of sympathy. And I really came to realize that as a technical terms, it always presupposes, in order for it to exist and operate, something that's fundamentally alike. And both at the cosmic harmony level and at the individual psychological level. And so Smith is really relying on that to make this moral and political point as well. I think I now tied several strands of your question together. The one other thing I want to say about this division of labor chapter, and this is something the last few weeks I've been totally fascinated by again, is that Smith's first major example of within the division of labor, everybody loves to talk about the pin factory, which is really there, but I love to talk about the boy, right? We're dealing with child labor, I admit that, but about the boy that really wants to play with his friends and so invents a labor saving device. Now, that passage, is one of the first things we encounter in the Wealth of Nations. And it's both emphasizes that all of us are intellectually potentially capacious, right? And it really emphasizes Smith's intellectual commitment to intellectual equality. But it also tells us that self interest sometimes means a desire to play with others, right? And this Scottish moralist, austere, parsimonious Scott Adam Smith, actually, he's valorizing uh, play and playing with friends, and he's valorizing also workplace ingenuity, right? He's really what he's describing is that technological innovation comes from the bottom up. It doesn't come from scientific management. It comes from letting people find ways on the work floor to improve their own circumstances. Now, how to manage that properly and that it doesn't get out of hand, of course, there are a lot of MBA style issues and work organizational psychology issues that he doesn't address. But yeah, once I realized that this is a guy that's defending play and friendship in that very analysis of the division of labor, I started to like him much more anyway. Then I thought like, okay, he's not only on the side of capital, he's not only on the side of oppression, he's really on the side of okay, how can we make the world a better place and more playful?
Totally. I actually, one of my favorite parts of your 2017 book on Smith is the section where you talk about the passage and then use that as a way of understanding the way he defines liberty. And then you've been working on this a bit in your blogging as well recently. And so there's sort of, yeah, I just want to kind of add two things or just and then move us toward like contemporary politics and debates because I in my work was very interested in sort of Smith's articulation of a kind of critique of socioeconomic inequality or political inequality in terms of how it distorts judgments. That's why I mean and in terms of throughout Theory of Moral Sentiments having an articulation of the way the public can harshly disdain people living in poverty, while at the same time, he's suggesting that to the extent that there are any people who might have a tendency to be immoral in their dealings with others and their actions, it's actually more likely to be happening at the very upper crusty parts of society where people aren't interacting in the market, and are relying on these more court social norms and flattery type of concerns. And so that's like a little bit more of this sort of critique, this concern with the fact that we might fail to sympathize with laborers or with the poor more broadly. And what I really like about your emphasis on the play passage is it has this sort of pleasure seeking, this sort of approval of pleasure and of joy at the center and at the heart of Smith. And it can be, and that it connects back, though, like you said, to that methodological, analytical egalitarianism, that assuming, people are equal in a lot of ways. And to the extent that we're different, it's mostly due to custom, habit, education, these social factors. And then that again, being analytical. Now, how far that equality goes in terms of politics is, I think, like a really big question, both for Smith and for us today, in terms of institutional designs or judgment based on outcomes, things like that. But that's why I kind of want to get back to this sort of, so then how do we think of Smith today and like liberalism today? Because, Smith, this idea of play being at the center of Smith's liberty, that's like I think that's not a very common way of understanding it. It's very much understood that Smith's arguing for this quote unquote natural, system of liberty, kind of paring away of certain government restrictions and barriers, policies like primogeniture that are affecting kind of people's liberty, and also policies like the law of settlement, preventing poor people basically from being able to move to different parishes for work, if they, all these sort of issues. And so I guess what I want to say is like, what does bringing Smith's emphasis on play and pleasure, and then also what you discuss in the book is this idea of security, that security under the rule of law is what also enables this sort of tight feeling of feeling both at liberty and feeling this ease of security. How does that relate to kind of contemporary issues? Yeah, because I think that Smith has a lot of power for people who are concerned with equality and maybe an understanding of liberty beyond freedom of contract, let's say.
Yeah, so there are at least two or three alternative ways of thinking about liberty, right? One is, as you just pointed out, the kind of freedom of contract, often treated as negative liberty or the liberty of the moderns. And surely Smith is not against that, right? I mean, he likes liberty of contract, but if especially constrained by a kind of harm principle that we don't harm others in our contracts. But I was really struck by the fact that contracts are really not that important as a metaphor for him. He, like Hume, is very critical of or not very receptive to the social contract. And I noticed this play passage. I really started to dig into it, and the way I translated his position in modern terms is I treat the play passage as a kind of metaphor for meaningful choices, where what we really want is to be able to pursue things that matter to us, some of which highly pleasurable, right? And that, if we remember our discussion about why he's not a Stoic, I think this is a very good, another very good reason to doubt that he is a Stoic. But also, I think to make space for not play only in terms of frivolity, but I also was struck by the fact that he emphasized about the boy the fellowship and camaraderie with other boys, right? And that made me think, okay, what he's really after is play as a metaphor for togetherness and finding meaning in life. And I don't want to go all new agey on Smith, but certainly having space for also more spiritual or more associative practices. So, but having said that, I also realized that I didn't think of Smith as a what we now call a Republican. That he's fundamentally interested in avoiding non-domination. I do think he cares about it, but I didn't think that the meaningful choices he's interested in are themselves constituted by equality or lack of hierarchy. They might very well partake in hierarchical practices in all kinds of ways. So once I ruled out that he wasn't a modern liberty guy or a ancient liberty guy, I realized, okay, I actually had to put him into a different, and he also wasn't a Hobbesian, where what he really cares about is unconstrained choice. I really, like a modern economist, rational choice decision is. I realized I had to, put him in a new category, and so this is why this meaningful choice enters in. I actually don't think I'm the first person to notice this. Somebody who I not especially sympathetic to, Mises. I actually think Mises also has a similar interpretation of Adam Smith because Mises describes economic freedom as really a stepping stone to spiritual freedom. And I actually think that is a kind of interesting potential interpretation of Smith. But in general, I don't follow Mises on these issues. So this in a way also I think sets up. So personally, I want to separate two things. I think there's I have and I'm glad you agree, a plausible reading what Smith is up to. But then there's also this other question: is okay? Does modern society, is this a useful way of thinking about it? And I think, in many ways, the world has dramatically shifted since Smith wrote, partially as an effect of the program of reform that he helped set up and that others carried forward. But I do think this is significant for contemporary liberalism because liberalism today, there's a left wing and there's a right wing version. There are libertarians and there are technocratic centrists. And so, liberalism is many different things. And sometimes nobody's willing to admit that they're liberal. And then other times, everybody with a degree is supposed to be liberal, right? So so I started to think about, okay, does this help in a way give some kind of coherence to what liberalism could be? And I think yes, because I think what this notion of freedom gets at is in fact something what we want from our social orders. I think there are all kinds of incredibly demanding political ideals. deliberative Democrats, certain kind of Marxists, certain kind of anarchists, where they really ask from us qua individuals to be constantly vigilant and to constantly participate in joint world making and joint politics. And that basically projects department politics on social life. And I think one of the great discoveries of liberalism is that we can divide work in such a way such that most of us are much better off if we don't have to do everything. Right? So that's really the division of labor. And cognitive division of labor, not just as an economic principle, but as a much broader social and political principle. And again, if you think about the origins of modern sociology, Durkheim and Weber, in a way they run with that and start thinking in terms of social theory that way. So I'm not saying like, oh, I'm the first person to notice this. On the contrary. But then I said to myself, but look, actually, what liberalism wants is both have a well functioning public order and at the same time create space for us to do our own meaningful things. And what's the kind of promise of that is we individually be much happier. We might also very well be much wealthier when we do that. But in our own choices, we also discover new ways of doing things, and that might indirectly benefit all of us. Right. So I start to think that what really the key insight of liberalism is that if we have this notion of liberty and make sure that society functions in such a way that we really have each of us really has this version of liberty, we also can constantly improve society, and each of us can flourish and be better in what we do. And that makes it all sound like, again, there are no costs, there's no friction. But of course, we're going to be constantly disagreeing and bumping into each other in all kinds of ways. And we might disagree strongly with each other, right? If we are socially embedded beings, we're going to be paying attention to each other in all kinds of harmful ways as well. But it occurred to me that this way of thinking about what freedom is about both is intuitively plausible and is in a weird way has kind of been forgotten by both professional academics and by professional politicians who are supposed to shape what liberalism is today, and even by activists who quite rightly are fighting for all kinds of important social causes. But somehow that this very straightforward and intuitive understanding of liberty and freedom, that we lost sight of that. And so I thought, okay, now this is actually something worth reviving and maybe telling people about. And if you agree, that makes two of us. So I'm happy.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I'm really struck by what I really appreciate about the argument is I like you. I'm not totally convinced that Smith fits into a more Republican understanding of liberty, but I also don't think he is perfectly, what you've said that it's perfectly captured by a negative liberty either. So the way that you're articulating it makes sense to me, but to your point about so then. The idea is so the role of politics, both potentially for Smith and then potentially for contemporary liberals, is to think about the political order or politics as institutions that enable both, public life and other private life or various spaces for self-development, which again, though, with Smith is actually quite social. It's not individualist in this atomistic sense. It's more associative. That's just and that's what it means to be an individual, that we are constituted by our relations with others. And I think that that's crucial. That is what I'm particularly interested in, especially my work against surveillance and in terms of privacy, thinking of it as more of like a democratic value rather than a purely personal value. And so the other kind of question, though, I have is that because when we talked around the invisible hand a little bit, and that's kind of my fault because I have some issues with it or how it's often used. So I'll just jump into it bring that back in here because sometimes people treat the invisible hand as basically Smith's politics, right? That, we need to follow his critique of mercantilism and the policy prescriptions he has in Wealth of Nations in order to enable an invisible hand, quote unquote, in a way to smoothly function better where people's pursuit of their interests ends up benefiting everybody as a whole. And I'm not saying that's not there, but I guess for me, what's striking to me about the various invisible hand passages are all the sort of details that are both in the context, but I don't know. So I guess to me is the invisible hand the way that we understand Smith? Is that really kind of his image of politics, or is there anything that that passage misses, or that idea of what a Hayek refers to and think it's in the sort of Hayekian approach, and thinking about these spontaneous orders as being sort of, I guess, in a way, a prescriptive argument rather than simply a descriptive argument.
Yeah, so you really put your finger on, I think, our agreement here. So let me, I'll repeat my own mantra here. I think the invisible hand, if you look at the free versions that he uses it, and if you look at the details, the phrase invisible hand is not about spontaneous order. It's generally about short term processes where the person acting could have known better, and where an informed spectator actually is in a position to say to the person acting, your consequences are going to be bad. Just don't do it. Look, you're going to do it anyway because you are, but and you don't know what's going to follow. But it doesn't mean nobody could know. So I think there is a really perverse historical fact that Smith, who really was interested in long term unintended social outcomes, somehow that the phrase invisible hand got associated with that. I don't think, I mean, the Theory of Moral Sentiments passage, it's easier to misread that way, but even there, it's not doing that work. Now, so that's like, like this Adam Smith problem. I never thought I was going to write about the invisible hand. And then I wrote a chapter about it, a very long, detailed exegetical chapter. And and I secretly hope that after this, we don't have to do it anymore. Much to my happiness, so far, my fellow Adam Smith scholars, they all seem to be very impressed with that chapter. So knock on wood. Now, to get to the twofold more important political part of your question, I don't think it's silly to read Smith as a theorist of spontaneous order. I also think that let's call it the social theory of spontaneous order that Hayek developed and projected onto Mandeville, Hume, and Smith. I think if you really want to understand that theory, you're much better off reading Hayek than either Mandeville, Hume, or Smith. I don't myself think ultimately that Smith is a theorist of spontaneous order if we understand by spontaneous order a frictionless bottom up reaching to a partial social optimum, right? Right. I don't think there's good evidence in Smith that he thinks that anything in social life is like that. Insofar as he has a model like that, he treats it as a counterfactual, a model that could have happened but didn't happen, that in fact is violated by historical or falsified by historical reality. But that's not to say that there isn't good use to be made of a social theory of spontaneous order. I just don't think Smith is the person to do that with. Having said that, I'm also, and maybe this is why I'm sensitive to it, I myself don't think that a theory of spontaneous order is a useful theory to help you think about how to generate a moderately decent society, because it disarms politics and it disarms collective action, where I think history shows if you want to create reasonably good social outcomes, you need some people to be politically engaged and to pursue collective action. So that's an empirical claim that could be wrong, but I also happen to think that Smith himself, in lots of places, says this as well. So just this week, I was reading Smith's account of the man of system again, which is something that Hayek and Hayekians trot out when this is discussed. And I noticed actually that and I'm not the first, I found someone else who noticed this too a decade ago, is that the language he uses to describe the man of system is more or less synonymous with the language he describes to describe his 18th century political economic rivals, the physiocrats. And what's the mistake the physiocrats make is that they think that if there's a wise legislator, it can impose the system of liberty on others, right? So Smith treats the physiocrats as liberals. He praises them for their free trade and liberty views. But the mistake they make is that if only there is a wise despot who can impose it on others, then things will come out okay. And then he says, look, that actually mistakes people's interests and people's prejudices. These are the words he uses. And I read that as that actually mistakes the nature of politics. Because in politics, you have to take other people's interests and their prejudices seriously. I think you've even written on this. He has this wonderful fable of Solon where he interprets, how to be a wise legislator. And part of being what a wise legislator is taking other people's interests and prejudices seriously. Now, the mistake of the physiocrats and the mistake of anybody that hearkens after an enlightened despot who can kind of set the system up and running and then it takes care of itself is this unwillingness to take politics seriously. Now, I don't want to caricature Hayek as only liking enlightened despots. That's not true. But I do think that there is a tendency in if you emphasize spontaneous order, if you just get it right once, then things will unfold by itself, bottom up otherwise, is that you then in a way block the hard political work that's needed to get the proper legislation and the buying off of interest or to finding ways where find win-win outcomes. Now, Hayek and Hayekians might say, look, what spontaneous order really is about is the bottom up judges who make law, and there shouldn't be any politics. But a law doesn't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, it's itself the effect of interest and itself the effect of biases and commitments of judges. Hayek himself actually has this amazing passage somewhere in the middle of Law and Legislation and Liberty where he acknowledges that judges can express their class interest for centuries on end. Right. Well, if you acknowledge that, then spontaneous order is going to be this very weird thing that, on the one hand, is the best we can do socially, and the other hand, just is class warfare successfully. Right. So I don't think that qua liberalism, that's a very good dialectical position to be in vis-a-vis critics of liberalism. Nor is it a good position if you care about the parts of liberalism that are about moral and legal equality, right? Because these things don't take care of themselves at all. So I did notice that, in fact, this is actually my new project that I've been thinking about the last 2 years or so, that in fact, this is not just a problem in Hayekians and people that believe in spontaneous order. I actually think that a lot of contemporary theoretical liberals and liberals in government dislike or have a suspicion of genuine politics. And that's why they like experts. That's like they like judges. That's like they want to deal with credentialed social justice activists. Is that actually there is a kind of suspicion that if we let politics do its things, we're going to end up in bad social outcomes. Now, empirically, that can be true, of course. But what that asks from us, I think, is okay, how can we think about politics in a way that acknowledges its messiness and its dangers, but at the same time also is enabling to us? And I actually think that Smith is not especially good on democratic politics, but he is actually reasonably good on how we should think about politicians who can do this well. So after my book, I thought I'd never write about Smith again. And then, of course, a few years later, somebody asked me to honor Chris Berry, who actually has this idea that you like as well, namely that for Smith, our independence is interdependent with others. That just is his idea of independence. So I thought, okay, let me reread Smith and write a paper about Smith's politics. And that got me thinking, even though I thought I was done with Smith, I think I can use him in part to talk about liberal politics today. I don't think he's sufficient for that. So I've been, scavenging other parts in the liberal tradition. But I do think that contemporary liberals, be they public reason liberals a la Rawls or spontaneous order liberals like Hayek, that they or even that they really don't like politics. And then we have this other position, namely the deliberative Democrat and the more Marxist position that actually demands from us 100% investment in politics all the time. And I think the genius of liberalism is actually to say, look, we need well functioning politics, but to do that, we don't always have to be busy with politics. If we organize society and if we allow society to organize itself in various ways, but that people do stay interested in politics. So that's the book I'm working on now, and that's also the blogging that you've been picking up on in the last few years.
No, great. Yeah. And just to like respond to, and I think those were excellent comments and thoughts on these topics.
We agree too much, Kristen.
I know. I was just thinking that. I was like, oh, I guess I I kind of it's kind of nice to be around somebody I agree with every once in a
I
while.
know, but I'm not sure it's going to make for good
Good good
good radio.
good
But
point.
yes,
Good point. Well, yeah, this is
we are the Mutual Admiration Society. I love the work of yours. I've read,
oh, thank you.
so it's not surprising.
Well, but I want to kind of think along with you because I do think that this is helpful to think through because I think for those who might listen who disagree with us, I mean, I think it's important to kind of understand each other. And so I think what is compelling to me about what you're building out with the blogging and what you're discussing with liberty and also politics is because I do sense sometimes this sort of way that some people approach politics is, it's sort of I think you put it in one of your pieces as sort of anti-political streak of sorts. And actually, so one of the things I love about Smith is he has this theory that is very similar to the modern concept of rent seeking in terms of his critique of mercantilism, but it doesn't take over his entire view of politics. It's a very particular theory that is also extremely embedded in kind of social forms of power or a theory of social forms of power. And so, I think it's very compelling because I think one thing I worry is that sometimes a public choice school, for example, seems to kind of treat all political movements and political actions as kind of rent seeking. And not everybody does. And I don't think it's necessarily inherent, but that's what I'm uncomfortable with because I don't think you can avoid politics to some degree as long as the world is imperfect and there are forms of entrenched interests enacting, that affect like things like, things like judges having a very strong impact on politics. And they have this authority that appears neutral, but actually has their own kind of biases or interests involved too. So as soon as you acknowledge that there's institutional weaknesses like that, then you have to figure out a way around it. And it's not going to be entirely just about rent seeking. But then, so just to get back to this idea of play and why these issues are, I think, relevant, why we should be thinking about them is because we really are, just to get to the theme of the podcast, we are in what feels like a very pivotal moment in terms of digital technology, and people talking about AI ethics. You have also a piece on Daniel Dennett's sort of critique of AI and this idea. And that is, so we have to we're deciding right now all the time, even just the way that we talk about technologies affects the way that we think about them and think about their politics. And there's sort of this, on the one hand, there are people pushing for regulations who are actually executives working in AI. And so I think you don't have to be a public choice theorist to be suspicious of that. Insofar as, okay, so what are they going to push for? Is it going to entrench their interests further? And how are they framing the terms of the debate? And is it obscuring things that we should actually be thinking about, whether intentionally or not? They might not intend to, but they have their own perspective on these issues that might be clouded. Their judgments might be clouded based on the position that they're in terms of how close they are to the technology, lack of other knowledge and experience that all sorts of people have. So I guess what I thought was interesting about Smith and this idea of play and this idea of meaningful choices, I think that's very compelling. But do you have any thoughts on how then we should orient ourselves specifically to political debates that are about technology, regulation of technology, or really just more broadly, sort of what does it mean to have democracy in this time of digital media, of what's called surveillance capitalism, all these things that sometimes I think people can feel like the world is just accelerating it. The development of technologies are faster at what we can keep up with. And so is there a role that in like returning to Smith, somebody who's talking about technological innovation as a way of getting play and something that's bottom up from workers, something that can be to the advantage of workers. And yet, a lot of debates today about sort of not necessarily feeling that this is advantageous to us. How should we think about that?
Okay, so I would love to take a class with you because you're so good at tying complex issues into coherent questions that I'm sure you're a wonderful teacher.
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
going to decompose again, but I wanna pick up on three themes. So first, I teach bread and butter survey courses, and so of course I have to teach Marxism as well. And I actually love teaching Marxism. I think Marx and Lenin and Luxemburg, they're fantastic writers and hilarious. So I love teaching. But I noticed that the Marxist interpretation of the state just is a rent-seeking state. Right? So then I was really, like, taken aback because I was like, "Look, that does really remind me of Virginia public choice," and it also reminds me of ordoliberalism, German liberals, who actually, and I'm by instinct, I'm very much an ordoliberal in lots of ways, and I was really struck that actually, Marxism and these, 2 traditions of neoliberalism, that they fundamentally agree that the state is rent seeking. And I said to myself, well, look, there are two possibilities here. A, they're both right, but then we really should rewrite the history of the debate between Marxism and liberalism, or they're actually in a way both really missing something important. And this gets me to the second level of your question. I think liberalism, because it trusts individuals to make choices, both in the marketplace and, as the Ostroms have emphasized, outside the marketplace, right? Our choices constantly are making new worlds. A part of this we can tell in this as a story of entrepreneurship, but part of this is also social discovery from the bottom up, where none of us really expect certain outcomes in light of our present pursuit of pleasure or meaning, right? So that means that built into liberalism is a constant potential for social events taking us by surprise, and including technologies, right? That's just the nature of liberal beast. So now I want to tie these two claims together with a further observation. I actually think that if we think about both profit and we think about meaningful choices that create new social groupings and new social differentiation, these also mean both the profit and the new groups, new actors that can partake in rent seeking. So every time that we solve an old rent seeking problem, we're laying the seeds for a new kind. Right? So notice what I'm doing is that I'm taking a kind of business cycle or Marxist crisis idea and say, actually, that's endemic to liberalism. Liberalism, by its very nature, is about world making and new world making and the structural development of surprises. And that also means that our institutions and our politics are potentially always lagging new social formation, right? They're never going to, unlike the Marxist who can say there is, we abolish the state and there'll be utopia, unlike a certain kind of liberal that suddenly has the perfect frictionless market and things will auto liberate. I think really adult liberalism recognizes We're constantly going to have new social challenges, and we're going to constantly feel that we're in a crisis, and one that, in fact, our resources outstrip our capacity to deal with them, right? I think that is, I personally think that is the human condition, but I think it also happens to be woven into the nature of liberalism. I'm actually surprised that this is not better articulated and understood within liberalism. Much to my own surprise, the only person I'm aware of that's really articulated this is Foucault in his lectures on biopolitics in 78, 79. I'd love it if readers who listen to us write in and say, well, actually, this obscure liberal that I love also sees this. But now that gets me to the third part, and this is, your concern with surveillance. And remember, I think Foucault came to his own insight in reflecting on the surveillance society. So I think there's this interesting resonance between the two of you. I think a lot of, I hope I haven't damned your career chance,
I know.
but what I think we then should look at, and this is in part a sober and empirical enterprise, we should just look at case by case how have we dealt with complex technologies that seem to have overwhelmed us and that have now generally been domesticated. And what we find is in fact many. So I myself have thought a bit about airplane regulation. Right, we have this amazing detail that in the last 5 years, actual airplane crashes that kill people are now statistically brought to zero. There are some years where there are literally no fatal airplane crashes. Some other years there are a couple. In fact, Boeing ruined it by uh, by rushing out the Supermax plane, whatever it's called. But and then if you look at the regulation of airplanes, there's a really fascinating story to be told about how the FAA actually has both the capacity and the input of businesses and experts and a kind of independence, such that there's this virtuous cycle of constant improvement in the service both for profitable airlines and consumer safety, right? So that's one model. There are many different kind of models. So I'm not saying that all the models are good models. If you look at nuclear power stations, we have a very different model. If you look at biotechnology weapons, we have a different model again. If you look at very ordinary consumer safety, we have other models. So I think when we are faced with new technological threats, we need academics, independent academics to study it. We need consumer activists and citizen activists to organize. And we need legislators sometimes or companies to provide solutions, right? And that's going to be a complex, dynamic interplay. I share your suspicion, and not to get to the AI part. I've actually been publishing on artificial intelligence. Normally, I'd say, look, I won't talk about something I didn't know about, but I do actually think that artificial intelligence raises interesting both design questions and questions of, let's call them externalities. First, to answer the part about Dennett. Dennett has this wonderful old material called the intentional stance. And it really just is a contribution to psychology. Namely, we have this tendency to anthropomorphize other entities, right? If you're a critic of religion, you'll use that tendency to unmask religion. If you want to explain why people attach to their pets, it's a very bread and butter psychological tendency. And I think a lot of manufacturers outside of AI have figured out that we have this tendency. And so they design products to take advantage of the fact that we do that and that we actually relate to products in virtue of this tendency to anthropomorphize or to adopt the intentional stance. Now, the intentional stance is also meant to be an explanatory feature. I don't want to say that then just figure out something that we already know. That's not the case. But what artificial intelligence does is it actually is fine tuned in many ways to take advantage of our tendency to overinterpret certain social phenomena. And that means that we can be tricked into thinking that a machine is really a conscious and emotive entity, and that we're also can be tricked into trusting machines that don't deserve our trust. Right now, Dennett himself thinks that the way to deal with this is very strict liability, and maybe that's the way to go. I myself think that look, what we really should do is allow in part this sounds remarkably Hayekian, is we should allow interested parties to bring suit when they're harmed, and we will see if the legal system can actually deal with the harms, or as you're hinting, that some of the surveillance and some of the harms are so perverse and endemic that we need genuine legislation. But if we need genuine legislation, the way to get reasonably good legislation, and notice I'm not a I don't think we need optimal legislation, but to get reasonably good is the way I've described. We need independent research, public hearings, we need citizens and consumer activists. We need business people to, make sure that the cost of legislation doesn't prevent any innovation. And we get what we have in a lot of products that get domesticated, both in the marketplace and through law and through legislation, right? And in a way, I think that's what liberalism is about. Is liberalism is annoying to its critics because we always say and. We don't just say, right? We sometimes say trade-offs, right? When we speak as liberal economists, we say trade-offs. But when we think as liberal political theorists, we think, well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that. And then over time, as a society, we find an outcome that's tolerable. Now, what that means is that in the face of perceived crisis, rather than saying, let things take care of itself, what we really should be encouraging each other is, okay, find a way to make a constructive contribution. Now, that won't win me any elections, right? It's a terrible slogan. Deconstructive. But I actually think, every age has its own sense of crisis. And undoubtedly, there will be a moment where humanity stops existing and perhaps stops existing because of its own mistakes, right? But, short of that, um, you should be encouraged to speak up in public because you're an expert on it. I myself, in my work on the ethics of AI, I think there's a very dangerous tendency among computer scientists and computer engineers to say, hey, social values, that's not for us, that's for society, because that's also a way not to deal with the problem. I actually think what makes AI interesting, and I think we might agree on this, is that it is itself a way of world making. And that if we look at the axiomatic choices that an algorithm has, is that those both create unpredictable outcomes, but they also rule out certain possibilities and they make other possibilities more likely. And it means then that if we can foresee that certain outcomes, like certain forms of discrimination or certain forms of public or private harms, those can be internalized in the process. I don't think we need strict liability for that, but we might be willing to incentivize that in all kinds of ways. Again, when we look at the nitty gritty detail, that might get technocratic, but what it does require is people to get upset, to organize, to collaborate, to find friendly researchers who have independence. And if we have a healthy political life between citizens, experts, legislators, lawyers, and lobbyists, we'll find a messy compromise that can get things done. There might be the case that by gamifying our social world and by this permanent surveillance, that disables the political process that I'm trying to make space for. right? So that would be an argument to say, hey, this time is really special. But what that tells me is, okay, we just need to mobilize even further and harder, and we need to be willing to speak up and maintain our independence as academics, and be in our own limited way activists with others. I democratic life and liberal life is not the answers are not never obvious, and it's not always easy how to get from here to there. But yeah, if you don't do anything, the bad people will get their say, and you won't.
Yes, that's, I think, a really good point. I mean, it's politics goes on even if you don't join in. So,
Now, what I like about liberalism is you don't have to be energized by everything for liberalism to work well. And right, so I really think that what liberalism tells you, qua citizen, is to pick your battles, but those battles feel free to be fully vested because you might be helping lots of people think like you. I mean, all of us college professors know that if one student has a question, there's probably 20 to 100 who have very similar question. And I think something like that is true of, of social activism as well. When somebody gets mobilized, he or she is mobilizing for others.
yeah, and I think those are excellent points. I mean, they're actually there's such a great pithy. I mean, you might not think of it. I think of it as pithy explanation of a lot of like very challenging topics, and I think exactly what we should be kind of wrestling with when we're talking about these issues with tech. And I did. So we could easily end it with that. I don't want to take up more of your time. You've been so generous with your time. But I did want to kind of like, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, because I sort of said, oh, Smith has this very kind of positive view of like technological innovation, and he does, and he doesn't. I mean, it's actually, I think it's again sort of like the invisible hand and like the Das Adam Smith problem. You and I are probably, we think it's kind of, it's so obvious or whatever, but it's probably not that well known for people who aren't familiar with Smith. But the Smith sort of comments on the dulling effects of the division of labor, having these kind of negative consequences for workers. This very hyper specialized route like work can be very degrading in terms of one's intellectual capacities, but also feelings for being connected to each other, to the community, and sort of making moral judgments, but really any kind of judgment. And that comes in his argument for education, that there can be state public efforts to provide for education, even require education of children up to a certain age, things like that. And so I guess, yeah, I just wanted to make sure we kind of also put that on the table for thinking of, I mean, this sort of being able to both see technology as potentially empowering, potentially liberating, and technological change doing that, while actually kind of like what you said with politics, that every time you solve a rent-seeking problem, a new one pops up. So this sort of eternal thing with like technological change, there are all sorts of benefits, yes, but there are plenty of other consequences that we need to reckon with. Yeah, so I'm just getting your thoughts on that.
No, you are right. And in fact, if you look at the very careful wording of the passage that I've been pushing, the play passage, he makes it very clear that it's only a few boys that will actually. It's unfortunately gendered the example, but it's only a few of the boys that will make technological improvements, and he's very clear that many of the workers who do repetitive work, they will be, as the Marxists say, alienated in all kinds of ways. It's corrosive to intellectual life. It also facilitates treating people as means and not as ends. Right? People become more machine-like. It's so it is. If there is an Adam Smith problem, it is in a way how to reconcile the sunny optimism of the first 20 pages with the somewhat gloomy picture of the side effects of industrialization in and mechanization in part five of the Wealth of Nations. And I actually think that in a way that's the human condition again, right? we are, I think it's an anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, who said this, we are technological animals. We're cultured animals. I think for Smith, this is very clearly the case. And it means that often certain people benefit greatly from both existing technology, which is embedded in culture in all kinds of ways, and of improvements in it. And at the same time, there's a permanent danger that technology undermines us both individually, socially, and politically. And this is why I think, liberalism never ends. And I think political life never ends because how to deal with these side effects is of course going to be our individual and our family and our community's responsibilities, right? It's not like, oh, it just becomes the state's responsibility. But at the same time, Smith is aware that certain social problems only get addressed if we address them as collectives, both within what people call civil society or through the state. And sometimes these are complementary. I think one reason why I'm personally attracted to ordo-liberalism is that they were very self-conscious about the fact that for markets to work, the state had to do an enormous amount of prior work such that markets could do their job and also could maintain their jobs. I think this is true more broadly. I think what liberalism understands is that every technology has, this is, I'm sure we can find a Greek ancient myth that says the same thing, right? Has power to help us, but also has cost to it. And we want to domesticate these costs and where possible minimize them while holding on to the goodies, right? There are, let's say, certain kind of environmentalists, certain kind of utopian thinkers who want to turn their back on technology. And I think all of us who love camping and who love hiking in nature feel the pull of that attitude. But at the same time, it's great that we can have these little machines that tell us that we really cannot be fully lost in nature or untraceable if necessary, right? So at the same time, we might think, well, do I really want to keep the tracer on because I really don't want Microsoft to know I was in Utah last week? On the other hand, it has these benefits, and where to find how to think about what the right mix of these is, right? Sometimes, the market can help us figure that out and solve it for us. And sometimes, we need to collectively find ways to do that. Yeah, I maybe it's because I'm in a university and I'm around young people, but I love the fact that my students both show me that there are different ways of living and different ways of adjusting to technology, but also that you can also this give up on technologies that you don't think is useful, right? They laugh at the fact that I post things on Facebook, right? I mean, Facebook just that's just not for anybody who wants to be hip and cool, right? And um, all kinds of technologies that I think are essential to human flourishing, they've already given up on. So I think sometimes this is just generational stuff, and sometimes we need to work together. And I don't know, liberalism often gets criticized for being an ideology that favors talk over action. But it's only through talking that you can really figure things out together. And you've yourself in all the examples that of the positive Smith, right, of where he's optimistic, these all involve talking, taking position, figuring out how the other looks at things, and that's just, I think that's just a sensible way to live. Now, obviously, you need to be silent sometimes and listen, all that too. But yeah, doing things together means figuring things out together. And that means talking together, and being willing to feel together.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that that is what draws me so much to Smith. Yeah, I'll just note that I think with the pandemic, I think that, it's hard because I think there were a lot of disappointing ways that we saw people interact or understand the world together, but I think also, I mean, I know it gave me an appreciation for how much I treasure being with people and how important it is to be able to be with people, and that sort of dispelling that fiction of the sort of lone individual who can do everything on their own. And I think that that's something that I hope that we kind of move forward together trying to figure out. And also why I really treasure that we've been doing these podcasts because, we can be apart and still have this, very rich conversation and share it with others and hear from them. And technology is allowing us to do that.
I mean, pandemics, they are scary, right? And then when we are fearful, it's harder to make wise choices, and it's harder to have that sense of freedom that allows for play and spirituality and positive collective decision making, right? So when we both as individuals and as societies or even global societies get into this fear mode, right? It is to be expected that we'll make lots of below average decisions. I mean, if you read your Thucydides, you really see like societies can collapse, right? And I do think it's an interesting fact of America and Europe that we really had utterly forgotten how to think about pandemics and how to respond to them. And so that says something about our both our universities, our political leadership, and societies. You know, I got very sick during the pandemic, so I'm just very grateful I can have this conversation with you and be on the other side of it. I do think that liberals have taken public health very seriously for most of their tradition. And I actually think that, it's also, for me, it was a way to say, okay, how should we be? Can we hold on to liberalism when we are both individually and collectively afraid, right? Because that's what drives us into a kind of, politics of mistrust, the politics of Hobbesianism, strong states. We saw a lot of rent seeking, obviously. It's incredibly hard to remain faithful to joint and collective enterprises in the context of fear. But as you said, we also found new ways to connect to each other. And we've created institutions like podcasts that are now enduring, right? I'm of the blogging school, and I'm noticing, like, yeah, everybody's podcasting now, and I'm blaming COVID because now we've got this perfect technology where any one of us can really start doing this, and I'll concede defeat before long.
No, blogging is great too, and I actually did that more when I before I went to grad school, I did a little bit of that because I was working and I missed the political theory, and it was just nice to be able to write, and it was great. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about the pandemic because like I know that you were sick and really saddened me and saddens me, and I'm just so glad that you're doing better. And I think it's really important that we like acknowledge just how hard this pandemic has been on people and how it's deeply affected people because it's also about, sort of learning from how we acted with fear. And then also I think part of conquering fear and conquering sadness, those are things you can't avoid. You have to face them and face them together. And I kind of feel like that's something that we could all do a little bit more. So yeah, I think people are hastening to kind of just move on and be regular, normal, but I think it would be, good for us to kind of acknowledge how hard this time has been for people.
Yeah, let me briefly deflect it from my own experience. But as a teacher, I can tell that my students are really different kind of animals than the students I had 5, 6 years ago. They are really incredibly scarred from the pandemic. Their social skills and learning skills are very different than the ones I experienced a few years ago, right? So, as an educator, the pandemic won't go away for quite a while because it's very clear to me that my expectations of what to expect in the classroom has to be different than when it was a few years before the pandemic. So even if society wants to move on quickly and forget, as an educator, I cannot afford that, and my students can't afford that if I don't remind myself, and as an institution, if we don't permanently think about that. So that I really wanted to make sure to say that. I myself got very interested in, I have a background in philosophy of science originally, in how during pandemics science gets accelerated, and then how should we think about the organization of science, and how should we think about what happens to public discussions of science and expertise and medicine. So I, for myself, once I start to grow healthy again, the pandemic has also opened up all kinds of research projects that connect, I think, to liberalism as well. I've been working with Nick Cohen on that as well. Now, for me as an individual, I really, I took a lot of my own way of being in the world completely for granted. And what being disabled or impaired does is that you suddenly recognize that all kinds of constraints that existed in your life have shifted dramatically, right? Just to give a very basic example, for over a year, I had these terrible headaches, but I also wasn't able, I felt like I had this weird motion sickness. And so just everything having to do with balance and orientation were taken away from me and rejigged. And so that walking could be a completely ordinary activity and suddenly had become an achievement. That was just an enormous shift. Speaking professionally, it was really clear to me that a lot of bioethics and medical ethics really very naturally takes the position of a social decision maker and really refuses to take seriously the perspective of embodied agents. And so that, is really very clear to me, that when I had to deal with physicians and insurance companies and specialists, that I was being slotted into categories that served society in some sense perhaps quite well, but really were not serving me at all, and were in fact creating a second level of harm, right? So I was in my Dutch neurologist office, and after 10 minutes, and mind you, I was having this just unbelievably intense and weird headache. He says to me, "Yeah, you seem fine. Go away." Right? I mean, like, congratulations, you're on the other side of this disease. And I like the next day, I realized that if I were to remain silent in that moment, I would like let the system win in some way. But at the same time, I was like, I am really very sick. I don't have the energy to fight for myself, right? But it's so hard. And so then yeah, they end up making patients who are the most vulnerable have to fight for their own right to be heard, and at the other side are potentially well meaning medical experts, insurance companies, taxpayers, and employers, all of whom completely, reasonably sincere and well meaning citizens. Let's stipulate that. But you, the one who is least capable of fighting for yourself, is really then being asked to step up. And I remember that, like, when I wrote my email to this guy, I basically said to him, "Look, I played every card I could, right? I'm like this professor, my wife surgeon." And I said to him, "I know that a lot of patient complaints are the product of misunderstanding. So I'm going to give you a chance." I was like, "My wife's a physician. She's taught me this." I was like, "I'm willing to believe you misunderstood me," right? And the subtext was, "I'm going to make your life living hell if you are going to ignore this email." And I ended the email with Professor Dr. Eric Schliesser, like, he answered in 18 seconds, right? It was like this amazing moment. But I then spent 3 days in bed just exhausted from this paragraph email, right? And that was a victory. That was a victory.
Yeah, no, exactly. That was a good that worked out
Well, but,
well, you know?
yes, and sometimes the system can't help you, like I had these 2 years of migraines and, we tried a lot of things and nothing was working. And every time I started to do more social activities, I would collapse again. Yeah, and this was people like who said, "Well, maybe you should go to work because you'll get a new rhythm." And we've seen with other patients that it works. They were not trying to screw me or anything, but yeah. So the fact that you and I could talk on a screen for 2 hours is just like the most amazing fact of my life that I could not have fathomed. I would both treasure at one point, and that it would happen to me as it's happened. So yeah, I'm every day I count my blessing.
Yeah, no, and I so treasure that we could have this conversation, and also thank you for sharing your experience with us too, because I know for me it's very relatable, and I think for a lot of people it's very relatable, even if we have different things that we've experienced. But yeah, that idea of all the challenges you have to go through as a person in a doctor's office, even again, that doesn't mean that people aren't well-meaning, aren't have good intentions, aren't taking very seriously things. But it's actually kind of gets to Smith again. What's appealing to me about Smith is sort of this account of the way we try to communicate ourselves and be understood by each other, and the different challenges people have in understanding and really, really relating to each other, and sort of that's being kind of the central challenge of living together. And you can be sociable, you can be sympathetic, you can be other oriented, and still, that it's challenging to get through these things. So thank you so much again for sharing with us. And yeah, I really appreciated it. It was really great. Reflecting on today's conversation, a few central details from Smith's philosophy and Eric's own account of liberalism stand out to me. So, Smith's political economy and his work in general should always be seen as being grounded in his own account of social psychology. As Eric put it, for us, social psychology and moral philosophy are two totally different disciplines, but that wasn't the case for Smith. On the one hand, Smith's attention to our ability to empathize with each other, the basis of compassion and charity, is a serious challenge to those who think Smith sees us as entirely selfish or greedy or lone individuals competing with each other. On the other hand, the ability to empathize isn't perfect. As Eric put it, the ability to empathize also allows us to be strategic in our dealings with each other. In my work, I focus, for example, on his account of the public's tendency to disproportionately trust and admire the wealthy, but disdain the poor. Smith's account of interdependency amongst each other grapples with both what we typically understand as cooperation through persuasion, through working together, but he also gives an account of exchange as interdependency. This exchange as the appeal to self-interest. This is almost a kind of slogan associated with Smith, the idea that we get our dinner not from the benevolence of the butcher, brewer, and baker, but from this appeal to their self-interest. If the early chapters of Wealth of Nations are a window into Smith's account of human nature, it is one that defines us and what we have in common with each other, not with our labor, with our desire to work or something like that, but our tendency to exchange with others. Even beggars are fellow citizens in Smith's account. That's the term he uses. And their income may come from charity, but they rely on exchange just like anyone else to feed and clothe themselves. And this brings us to Eric's really interesting account of play as central to liberty, drawn from a story Smith tells us of a working child whose technological innovation left him at liberty to play with his friends. This is a celebration of the ingenuity of workers, of innovation coming from the bottom up. Very different from, I think, how we often think of innovation today, with a lot of lionization of entrepreneurs who occupy the C-suite. Eric uses this passage as a metaphor for meaningful choices, that liberalism trusts each individual to make meaningful choices for themselves. But this means that freedom is an unending process of, some of the words that Eric uses: world making, friction, disagreement, and in short, politics. I'm very struck by Eric taking this passage on play and developing his own account of liberalism, which he also at times refers to as adult liberalism. This reminds me that part of the process of growing up or maturity comes with expanding our perspectives by learning about others, learning how to cope with the challenges of life, but it is also a process that can bring us back to ourselves. We realize that maturity is not about forsaking play, but can mean returning to the frivolity or the silliness that we thought we had to shed to be mature, or the excitement about trying new things, of treating others as new friends to make as equals. These are all sentiments and desires at odds with what Smith worried about, with the hyper-specialization and the division of labor, as Eric and I discussed. This fear Smith shared that human beings could become machine-like, have their intellectual and emotional capacities dulled or suffocated. We discussed how against this liberalism that accepts the persistence of politics, of disagreement, of world-making, contrasts with other visions of liberalism and other political philosophies that dream of a world that has transcended politics. I think we see such dreams in the way that we often celebrate digital technologies and AI. People express this hope that AI can solve all these economic challenges fairly and efficiently, or that we can have a division of labor where AI sorts out our democratic processes for us. I definitely think there are possibilities for technologies to help us cooperate, to support us in our own artistic creativity, in our everyday work, in deliberating with each other and deciding who to vote for. But even ensuring those optimistic outcomes require political work in the first place. For example, many of today's technology companies, including those in AI development, rely on poorly compensated human workers around the world, whose menial labor, labeling data or moderating content, may not be the physical work of the pin factory per se that Smith discussed, but it is monotonous, grueling. There is hope that content moderation could be automated. But in the meantime, it requires workers to witness traumatic images of horrific violence again and again and again. A nightmare that Smith, with his emphasis on experiences of sympathetic spectatorship, would not treat lightly. Eric's engaging of Smith's account of play and innovation brings out the importance of human flourishing and ingenuity for people at all places in the global political economy. It helps us have a vision of politics that both copes with its inevitability, its ceaselessness, as well as the myriad pleasures that we can derive in our lives together. All features of Smith's thought and features of the challenges that we face today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks for listening. Till next time.